Do you just kind of hang out,
I
or?
Yeah, I mean, I just try to pretend that nothing's ever happened, or that I don't know whether people are watching or not, to be honest. So I'm here
Okay,
for you. So
no, I'm good with that. I just always
uh,
I'm curious. Well, it's Dead Space. Maybe I need music. Anyway,
yeah.
welcome to Jen's awesome show. And I have I have a lot of questions, but the one that's absolutely burning a hole in my soul, I'm dying to know. What are you doing with bees?
Oh, with bees. So not anything huge specifically. I've been keeping bees for about 4 years now in the backyard. But I come from a biology background, and there are a lot of things about bees that have fascinated me on the genetic side of things. They're also incredibly accessible for RNA interference, which is my specific subfield. You can actually feed them directly in the cells with the RNA that you're looking to influence, and you can see the effect on the bees later on. So I'm very excited to have a little free time to get into that, because you can order basically printed RNA these days. And yeah, bees are being threatened, especially by the Varroa mite, which is a pest
Mhm.
that's been spreading, oh, I want to say maybe 30 years, 20 years. It hasn't been a long time, but it's been just devastating on them. And there are a lot of ways that you can control them using things like RNA interference. But the work there's still a lot of work to do on that, so yeah.
Okay, that's really neat. So, for someone who's kind of new like me, what is RNA interference?
So basically, yeah, this is I should roll back a little bit. I had a biotech company before this, and so RNA interference was our specialty, where we used it to control weed species, to basically
Okay,
make a herbicide where you could wipe out a single species without hurting anything else in the environment.
which
And
is
so it
cool.
uses RNA interference for this, which, if you think about like a traditional, say, herbicide or a drug,
Hmm.
they affect usually a protein, right?
Yeah,
And they fit somewhere in the protein and change the protein shape, right?
right.
But if you imagine, like, there's a lot of shapes that could do things, and there's a lot of shapes that might have a lot of crosstalk across a whole bunch of different proteins, right? But if instead you look at the DNA or the RNA sequence, you can be a lot more specific. And so now we can use matching sequences that we insert in to basically target genes, but only at variable regions where you know that you're only going to hit that gene and not other genes, either within the organism, which is usually an issue for people,
Hmm.
or within the environment, which we were looking at for the invasive weeds. And so, if you find the right sequence matches and you build the right constructs and get them delivered properly, then you can have your effect very, very, very precisely, instead of having a lot of crosstalk or off-target effects or side effects. Um, and so when I was doing the biotech company, one of the biggest issues was manufacturing costs around the RNA itself. And actually, since COVID, since the vaccines have been produced, they use very, very similar techniques to the RNA that we were looking to manufacture. So the costs for RNA are actually going way down, which is
Which
very
is
interesting.
awesome.
There's a whole new field of things that are opening up because of that. It's a very interesting side effect. You wouldn't have thought that we'd get that out of this. So,
No,
yeah.
that's really neat. So, you can use the RNA interference to make the bees less susceptible to the varroa mite, or how does that
Yeah,
kind
so
of work?
there are a couple of options, right? Like, you could control genes that would be involved in things like hygienic behavior, right? How the bees
Hmm.
actually behaviorally groom each other. You can control them maybe based on things like size, right? Because
Okay.
smaller bees are able to groom differently than larger bees. There's a theory, and I don't know how proven this is out, that the frames that people have been using with a lot larger cell size, they produce larger bees. And there's also a chance that because they produce a larger bee, there's more room and more time for the varroa mite to establish itself within there. And so potentially
Oh,
doing things like altering the timing or the size of the bees that emerge could change things. Also, the mites, they have a very, very short window to run into these cells and
hmm,
get in there with the bee before the cell is capped. And so if you adjust the pheromones that the bees are putting out through all of that, the chemical signals that the mites are using to tell when they need to get into a cell, they might be able to, they might miss all of those opportunities. Similarly, they have to produce Honestly, I forget right now, but I believe what happens is they produce a female first, and then males. After that, it might be more than one female that are produced first in the cell before the males. So if you have bees that are really rapidly maturing, there may be no time for male mites to be produced, or for, yeah, I forget if it's the other way around or not, but I think it's that way. So there's not enough time for male mites to be produced in the numbers that would be required for these things to breed. So I don't know, there's a lot of hooks that you could get in here, but like really there's just a lot of experimentation that's going to be needed.
That is
Yeah.
really, really neat. And so
Yeah.
you keep bees. What kind of bees do you have?
So standard honeybees in the
Yeah.
backyard. Yeah, Apis mellifera. There's a group out here that breeds Varroa resistant bees. And
Okay.
so I'm looking to get some of those next year. We've
Mm-hmm.
been working on just sort of, backyard, more standard mutt bees recently, but I really like the work that they've been doing. I got a dissecting microscope and a few things set up because it's nice to be able to check for the Varroa counts if you're going to buy an expensive species of bee and then try to maintain a Varroa
Yes.
resistance, especially when it's not linked to anything. But the bees we've got are quite dark. They're not super duper golden, classic
Yeah,
Italian looking honeybees. They're very much more on that like Russian, carniolan dark side of things. So very cute though.
I bet.
Yeah.
Bees are wonderful.
Oh, it's great. And
So,
then we've got a lot of mining bees in the backyard as well. So there's
yeah,
a lot of non-native species, or sorry, of native species back there as well. Yeah, I've been really enjoying checking out the flowers. We've got a little orchard, just like 5 trees in the backyard,
nice.
pears and apples and plums. And yeah, they're all just finishing up their flowering cycle. And it's been neat to see just how many species you can spot in there. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, I have a couple of mining bees too, but not very many. They're in my
Oh,
front garden hanging out, so trying really hard to teach the kids, no, don't step on the garden, don't dig in the garden, don't touch the garden.
yeah, right. Like a lot of it is about just not disturbing things, right? And also
Yeah,
preventing, like, yeah, some of the grasses from getting a little too tight and intense, but mostly it's just leaving that space. And
yep,
yeah.
definitely.
Mm.
So, assuming that you're successful in doing something that helps with the resistance to the mites or changes the behaviors of the bees, um, what other parts of the world were are in the natural world, I guess, would this have an application?
So basically, everywhere except for Australia right now is heavily impacted by the Varroa mite. It's been spreading constantly, and at this point, it's basically just Australia that is free. I believe New Zealand has it, and Australia doesn't. Australia has a big Sentinel program too, where people volunteer to have their hives inspected super regularly. Any hives, especially near ports and things like that. And if they find anything like the Varroa mite, then there's a huge clampdown on the situation. So, yeah, they've
Okay.
managed to remain free so far, but. There's also a new mite coming up, and so hopefully it's not going to be as big a problem, but we'll see. It's a pretty aggressive one called tropolalaps. And so, yeah, techniques like this might allow us to maybe skip the whole chemical control phase of
Which
all
would
of
be
that, where
great.
that kind of more traditional resistance builds. Yeah, it's just not, it hasn't been proven useful
Yeah.
enough, like especially when you're trusting other people to use it according to labels and when like I don't know,
Yeah.
there's a whole bunch of issues with that. Same with the herbicide front. And yeah, it's nice to just figure something out that, doesn't rely on that kind of careful scheduling.
Definitely. Well, that's good to know. Um, so, what other projects have you done? I mean, you've worked with bees, you've worked on an herbicide. What other applications has your knowledge been involved in?
So those were the sort of the main things. The biotech company Stemshock took quite some time. I think we were at it
Yeah.
for about 8 years. We got a patent on it, and had to find a company that was ready to take it through regulation and all of that because it's incredibly expensive to get any new active ingredient through regulation. And when we were doing all of this too, RNA interference based products and RNA stuff in general was still a little bit new, right? Like there's always been things like the control for rainbow papayas. There's been a couple of things that have gotten in, but they weren't classic RNA interference necessarily. People didn't necessarily know what was going on at the time or why they worked for some
Yeah.
of them. And then there was at least one that was in potatoes that was getting regulated at the time that we were going through this to control, I think it was potato Colorado potato beetle, and it
Yep.
seemed really interesting. But it was a potato that was producing this RNA endogenously, so you would genetically modify the potato to make a bunch of the RNA, and that's an interesting thing. But like genetically modified organism regulation is a whole other problem too,
Oh
right? And
yeah.
we're so much more interested in that transient effect. You know, you feed something, you spray something, it has an effect for a while, and then that effect goes away, but what you've accomplished stays. Um, so yeah, we did a lot there. This all sort of came out when I was in university. I co-founded a iGEM club at the University of Victoria. iGEM is the International Genetically Engineered Machines Competition, and so you basically at the time you would be given a kit of genes, all of which had little sequences on the end of which that allowed them to be combined really easily. And so then there was a little bit of software that you could also get access to that you could use to sort of schematically put it all together, and you build little toys basically in E. coli. So we did a couple of years of that and learned a lot. And yeah, after that, realized that there was just so much that could be done as the cost of DNA synthesis dropped. So yeah, we had a lot of mail order genetic projects basically that we got going to get there. And yeah, so then, yeah, after I left Stemshock and we sold that, I was under a non-compete for a little while. So that's when I got into NFTs. I had a little bit of downtime and I found Axie Infinity.
Yep.
And so, yeah, playing that got me a lot more involved in the NFT space in general. And then, yeah, when the gas got really high in ETH the first time from Axies, so after the CryptoKitties burst, there was another big burst sort of, a little over a year ago now or so, or a little under a year ago, I think. And you couldn't breed Axes for any reasonable price at that point, so I started looking for other projects, and that's when I found Wax, as well as Flow blockchains. And from
Mhm.
Wax, I got involved with Cogs first as a community member, and then I was on board with Red Fox Labs for a while as research and growth lead. And so Cogs is out of Vietnam, and then once Red Fox Game or R Fox Games split off from Cogs or split off from Red Fox Labs. Red Fox Labs is a bit of a um, they're a venture builder, so they'll sort of
Okay.
design and build and operate a business for a little while, and then sort of leave it with better management at that point, who can take and run with it. And
Yep.
so our Fox Games was the first example of that model. But between Red Fox Labs being in Vietnam and our Fox Games in Singapore, I was on a very heavy night schedule for a while and was
Oh
starting to go
yeah.
just a little bit crazy from it. So
Hmm.
I finished up with there and then realized that there's a space for me here with the uplift and got involved a month and a half ago or so now. So just been running ever
That's
since. And
fantastic. So, do you have a background in sort of game or metaverse development, or is it just something that seems to come naturally to you?
no, I mean, this sort of stuff has always been a passion for me, right? Like it's a
Hmm.
natural extension of like buying and selling and trading collectibles. You know, when I was a kid, I
Yep.
used to, go through the classifieds in the newspaper and buy video games or video game consoles and play them for a little while and then sell them at a garage sale for more money. And, traded
Hmm.
Pokemon cards when I was a kid. And, getting into that with the NFT space was very exciting, and having the time and the space because I was working at the time and, had some financial freedom was very liberating. And so I just poured into it, got, simultaneously deep into the blockchain stuff and into the gaming side of things. And the blockchain I had been doing a little bit, like back in 2011 or so, we were mining Bitcoin to heat our house. We had like 5 people in a silly little house in Victoria with bad heat. And so we were running a computer in the main room and a computer in the bathroom to keep things warm and just mining Bitcoin off them.
That's
And so
ridiculous.
yeah, but then we put all that away when I was doing work and all of that, and so yeah, I used that to get going in Axes, and yeah, but there was quite the winter there for me in crypto, and yeah.
Yeah, I've heard about that. I have to confess I don't know a whole lot about it, but I have heard about it. So,
Yeah.
what interests you the most about the uplift?
Um, well, it was exciting that there was a game first, that there was already a
Hmm.
place where people were able to start to hang out, and I saw the potential there and really wanted to help get as many more people in game as possible. The development cycle for games can be so long, right? And it can be really
Yeah.
difficult to know if you've being focusing on the right elements of the game. There's a lot of blind alleys that you can run into, and this seemed like a very natural thing to look at, to just overlay the blockchain elements on something people already understood. So that was very exciting on a technical front. I also really liked the way things like the rewards module were described and how much of the reporting would be done on chain. When I was doing COGS, the COGS game itself is entirely on chain, so there's not even a multiplayer server. Everything is written as a smart contract, which is really fantastic and super interesting.
Yeah.
But it's also very hard to modify, right? Or to do anything, super duper new
Yeah.
with
Okay.
instantly. Like, it takes some
Yep.
development and some auditing and, making your front ends match with it. It's a new field, right?
Yep.
Whereas this stuff is a lot faster to iterate. There's a lot more that can be done when you're sort of just hooking into something like Minecraft, and doing things like reporting events to the blockchain is fairly natural. So that was exciting to me. And then just the community, right? Like, I had
Yep.
been watching the YouTube videos for the uplifters and seeing the gratitude ceremonies, and had thought that this is a fantastic group of people. I actually simultaneously I got into Uplift Art when it did its first launch,
Mm-hmm.
so I was fairly heavily involved in that, and I loved their upgrade system, the way they set things up. That was part of when I was
Yes.
with COGS, when I was trying to figure out the tube system there. I looked at the upgrade system from Uplift Art as a bit of inspiration there. And so between seeing what they were doing technically, what they were doing artistically, musically, and just like culturally, seemed like a really neat place to be. So.
Definitely. What do you hope to learn from your current experiences with the uplift?
Oh, I mean, I'm always trying to learn new things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And right now, there have been a couple of simultaneous areas, right? Like, there's been some new technology that I'm getting into.
Mm-hmm.
I personally haven't had to do a lot of code at all,
Yep.
since back in my biotech days, like using some Python and stringing together some modules other people have built. But like, now I'm doing a lot of, like, I'm looking at JSON files, and trying to
Mm-hmm.
figure out how to do some data analysis on that. And that's a little bit new to me.
Yep.
That some of it, there's overlapping stuff, but some of it's definitely new. Um, I'm really looking forward to getting into the iterative, like, feedback based game mechanics and economics design, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
we're with Upliftium, with the rewards module, with the kind of multi-world survival worlds, and with all of that stuff that we've been looking at. There's going to be a lot of places to sort of, yeah, to see where levers need to be moved, to see if there's new services to open up in there, and to see how, like, the feedback's going to be pretty rapid.
Yep.
And it doesn't necessarily even require a whole lot of simultaneous people to start to get really interesting feedback from that, and I think that'll be really fun. Coming over from biotech and stuff, where, like, again, where the cycles were so long, you would do a bunch of development, you would order something, you would get a plant transformed or something like that, and then it would be 3 months of waiting, right,
Mm-hmm.
until you figured out how things worked. Getting to do things fairly quickly has been, it's still pretty novel to me.
Yep.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think that's big stuff. I didn't know a whole lot about Minecraft either. I've played Dwarf Fortress a lot, which is, not super duper dissimilar, but is not a multiplayer experience. And,
Yeah.
I had just sort of skirted around the edges of it, helped cousins and stuff set things up, but like hadn't really sat down and gotten involved until the uplift. And there's a whole lot to learn there, and it's certainly very deep and interesting. I've been watching YouTube videos on some of the longer lived Minecraft multiplayer servers, and there's fascinating stuff there as well to dig into. Um, yeah, mostly that stuff. I've been
Mhm.
sort of on my own pursuing things like some NFT minting and Blender and a few other 3D stuff.
Yeah.
And, but that's, it's kind of nice to have some hobbies that aren't necessarily immediately dovetailing in with work. Like, I know I could lend
Yes.
skills here or there if needed, but like, we've got rock stars on those areas. So I can just sort of explore my own hobbies a little bit too, and focus on what I'm doing well here with the uplift. So, yeah.
Definitely. So, a bit of a deviation here. If you could make a really big mess with no repercussions, no budget, no cleanup, no responsibility, what would you do and why?
Ooh, blockchain specific or outside of blockchain?
Absolutely anything.
All right. Well, I mean, this is out there a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll try to explain it. But one of the things I've always sort of talked about is, um, we've had a long period of time in biology where evolution was driven by generative forces, where like mutation and big open niches allowed for a lot of diversity to come up in a generative way. And then we
Hmm.
had a huge period of time where selection, be it natural or artificial, has sort of whittled a lot of that down. And meanwhile, genetic complexity of any organism has sort of gone up to the point where it's very hard for genes, for innovations basically that one organism has, to spread out to other kingdoms or families or any other areas, except for things that they can directly breed with. And so like if I could make any mess as big as possible and use as much budget as possible, it would be to figure out a way to refactor a lot of those, especially protein coding sequences that are novel and have taken a lot of time to evolve, things like, chitin or like, opalescent materials or neat structural materials or like enzymes that do really fascinating things, and figure out how to refactor them and give eukaryotic life, multicellular life, the same type of like trading cards, genetic trading cards, as prokaryotic life has in plasmids, right? So try to have a lot more of that shuffling of diversity that could then allow for new niches to be maybe repopulated again, instead of just like things continually being selected against. Because we're not going to stop the extinction of species when there are niches that are disappearing, but it doesn't mean there aren't new niches. It's just the time scale is wrong for biology as currently exists to colonize those niches. And I don't know, figuring out a way to do something there would be very cool, but like you say, it would be expensive and messy and
Oh,
not something that one
definitely.
can do by oneself. So,
It would be
yeah.
all of that. So,
Mm.
in terms of creativity, when you approach a problem that needs solving, something like the scenario you just described, do you start with an idea? Do you start with a problem that needs a solution? Do you start with a pattern of things that you typically look for? Like, how does your creativity work?
So we've gone a few different ways. Like I'm a good workshopper, so especially when there's other people around, I'm fairly good at like retracing what we've been talking about, trying to find threads that were productive, and trying to like write down a few actionables or figure out something that we can do from it.
Hmm.
So there's often a big phase, or there's a portfolio or a binder somewhere where we're writing down things like that and just trying to keep track. But then, like when we were getting ready to do Stemshock, we deliberately went through a lot of that on from that problem solution type approach. Like I did a lot of pitch competitions with
Hmm.
Stemshock, toured around a lot, and yeah, it was quite interesting. And you really started to learn, especially from seeing all the other projects, how to do it, how not to do it. You could sort of tell when there were projects that were people who were just super fired up about an idea and were still trying to find a place to make it fit. You could tell where there were problems, but those problems didn't necessarily have the financial power behind them for a
Yeah.
solution to necessarily be viable in the economy. There are all sorts of issues like that. And so learning to not get too fixated on any one specific idea until it's provable that there's something we can actually do with it was something that was important to me. And I still try to take a lot of that. And I do a lot of reading. I'll try to spend as much time as I can before I actually start doing anything, just like finding out what other people have done that is similar to this. I'll watch YouTube videos, put on some audiobooks, and do a lot of
Mhm.
reading and just, because the worst thing that happens is if you get super far down a path and then you find out that there's somebody else that's doing something that's far enough along that you could have just stood on their shoulders a bit instead. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Hmm.
Okay. So, why do you think the uplift has become necessary now? Because it certainly seems like it has from
Yeah.
inside.
I think there's two things. I think one thing is, compared to the other metaverses, it's definitely been a community first, right? There was a
Hmm.
group of people that has then continued to bring more people in a way that feels very intimate, right? And the other
Yep.
virtual spaces still feel empty sometimes in a way that the uplift doesn't quite, because of
Yep.
that intimacy. Like even when there's not a whole lot of people in the server at any one time, there is a bit of a different feel. Also, I think Minecraft itself lends itself to that. Like, not when you're alone, the world doesn't necessarily feel like it's empty anyway, whereas places like Decentraland or Cryptovoxels can still get that eerie feeling sometimes, that ghost town feeling.
Yep.
um, I find Somnium Space is doing a really good job trying to approach that. They have an awful lot of events, and I think their ability to do things like full body tracking and a lot of other things in there definitely makes that world feel more immersive. But it's something that everything is struggling with. I also think that like there's a lot of idle stuff you can do in the upland, or sorry, in the uplift. Like if
Yeah.
you're, like as long as you have land, or when you're whitelisted on something, you can do some idle mining, or you can explore things that other people have built, and like especially if you're going to get involved in survival mode worlds and things like that. There's a lot of activity just to sort of keep going there, right? Whereas the other spaces are still very much like malls or display oriented spaces, right? Like you build and you
Yeah.
create something and then it's sort of done, and smart people are figuring out how to like staff places for sure. It's definitely evolving, but yeah, I feel like we've got a bit of a interesting head up there.
I would agree. And if you were in the business of giving advice on how to form a community, what do you think the Uplift did right there?
Honestly, like the video content, the YouTube content has been very helpful, right? And having it very regular but also very sporadic. Like people never know for sure if there's going to be more content than sort of the skeleton of what's already there, and it's very casual. It doesn't feel hyper produced. And I think that like I don't watch a lot of Twitch, but I think that sort of live streaming side of things, that intimacy as well, is something you guys have brought over in a way that a lot of the other groups maybe haven't quite the same way.
Okay.
Yeah. I spent a lot more time in Discord than Telegram as well. So like when I'm
Mhm.
like the main Telegram for the Uplift is also sort of the biggest Telegram that I'm in, period. So
Yep.
it's hard to necessarily know how much of that is normal across Telegram communities and how much of it is that community's particular special this. But like that one threaded nature and having so many people that clearly know each other and are riffing off of each other constantly is pretty special. And
It
yeah.
is. It is. Yeah, I'm not big into Telegram either. I hadn't heard of it a month ago, so
Oh
it's
yeah.
learning. But um, what kinds of things inspire you? What do you find inspiring?
Hmm. I mean, I find a lot of the forms that we find in nature and biology really inspiring. I've got a
Hmm.
macro lens and a camera, and I really enjoy going out and seeing what I can find that way. Emergent systems are very inspiring to me. Like anytime
Hmm.
something seems to be greater than the sum of its parts is super interesting. I find some of the stuff we've been doing with artificial intelligence really inspiring that way. Like there's a YouTube channel, 2 Minute Papers, that covers a lot of recent breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, often with regards to image processing, but also, a bunch of stuff outside of that. And like it is inspirational to see the people who are working on this, where they have to come up with shortcuts and where they have to come up with brainstorms in order to give these AIs the right kind of information and training data to get something useful out, right? And the interplay between that is really interesting. Um, Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of people on Twitter that I definitely find, or like in the space that I find inspiring. People who are big builders in the space, Koopa Troopa, and I find Jimmy very inspiring. He builds a lot of smart contracts that are just fascinating. Anybody who can get such heads down and write anything in Solidity or EOS Sharp, is very just downright inspirational to me. So.
Yeah. If you were in the business of not so much recommending necessarily, but sharing your top three favorite scientific reading spots, what would they be?
Ooh, like websites or like specific articles and such?
Websites, articles, journals, whatever you have.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I've got a Feedly that I've been sort of curating for a long time, which it's an RSS aggregator. So I've got a lot of different like websites in there, and I'm not always aware of what I'm at. But like I
Okay.
always notice when I'm reading things from Hackaday, I find their stuff is just really interesting. It's not super biological; it's mostly technological, but it's really interesting. Cory Doctorow, like his
Mm-hmm.
podcasts, his blogs, almost anything he does is worth checking out and seems like to be a good jumping off point in the space. Um, hmm, let's see specifics beyond that. Yeah, let me think a bit beyond that, maybe while we're chatting. But yeah, the problem with Feedly is that I'm not always aware of which site I'm on anymore.
Yeah, well, that's a thing.
Um, but
Okay. I'm just always looking for new and interesting things to look at, really.
oh
I'm
yeah.
I'm curious.
And of course, like I always forget the name of it, but SciHub is huge for me, right? I'm not sure if you're
Okay,
aware of
yeah.
that, but using SciHub to gain access to academic papers that you may not have access to. It's a group that have been working for a long time to make it very easy to get into things that are notoriously paywalled from universities that are still being publicly funded for this research. So, yeah, if you ever need to get into a paper, it's a really good place to go.
That's good
So,
to know because that's something I've run into lots of times.
yeah,
That
SciHub.
paywall. Sign up. Okay.
Yeah.
So, getting close to the end here, but we can't forget to talk about chicken caw
Oh, yes.
because that
Uh,
is coming up quickly here in Land and Rail auction. What is different or new or amazing or special about the chicken caw land and rail auction in the uplift?
Well, I mean, this is the first one that we're doing through an auction, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is also in a lot of ways the first land sale that is happening, and that as soon as you get the land, you're getting right onto your land, right? We
Yeah.
don't have any waiting periods. We don't have any intermediary NFTs. You're literally buying at auction the NFT for the plot that you want to be on, and you can choose how much money you want to spend on that, and especially considering how much competition there might be.
Yeah.
So like the probe event was designed to be really erratic and spontaneous, and for people to have a chance at getting a whole bunch of plots, chance at getting a lot less, and just to see what happens, because the probes were also sort of a gratitude reward, and it was just an exciting event. But I anticipate a lot more meticulous surveying here and a lot more sort of shrewdness in the bidding. Also, the way that we're working on our interface for checking out how the auction is going, it's going to be really neat to see how that develops and to see which plots and which regions are under or hotly contested.
Yeah.
See if that translates to future worlds as well. This will be the first like major data that we'll be able to get from this, and I'm sure that the auction model will, be something that we look at in future worlds as well. And we're still learning which lands are special to people. Like I'm seeing people build on
Yeah.
ocean plots in creative mode as if they were land. So like
Yeah.
I personally was kind of thought that ocean plots might be a little less valuable, but I can see them suddenly gaining a lot of value. So like I don't know,
Mhm.
there's a lot to learn.
Definitely. Yeah. It's going to be curious to see if any one type stands out more than the rest in the end.
Yeah. And then I mean we're always curious what surprises the seven have in store once the world is more or less officially live. Like, I'm not sure what you are thinking
Well,
about that, but it's going to be a big day a couple of days from now.
well, I think what I'm thinking is, oh, we haven't talked about that yet. Either that or I haven't been in on those conversations. So that's going to be real interesting. Um, and I didn't write this one down, but DAX, decentralized autonomous communities. I think there was some talk of something like that starting up on the Discord for London.
Ooh.
What are your thoughts on things like that just happening?
Yeah, so I think that's super duper exciting. And I think, again, like emergent behavior and emergent systems like that of all are inspirational to me. I think that there's lots of conversation and work that we're already looking at on ways to try to rigidify or solidify or like make available systems for
Mm-hmm.
DAX or DAOs to be able to function under. But like ultimately, a group of people who are organized and, who have a way of making what they've decided known to us is going to carry a lot of weight, right? And so I think that these things emerging on the early side can't be bad. um, I've always been super interested in this stuff. Like back when we were forming Stemshock, we always talked about the need for a choose your own adventure company. Basically, like just a bunch of check boxes that you would be able to
Yes.
go through that would result in a company that was more or less fully booted up, and that idea, like, it hasn't been until DAOs with tokenized access like this that I felt like you could almost move and be like not quite a shareholder, but a member of a community, a member of a governing body with whichever DAO you think your interests most align with, and where the inertia isn't so large for moving between them. So I don't know. The stuff is very exciting, and I think there's still a lot of formalization happening. But I try to follow it. Like metagame is really interesting to me, and
Yeah.
I'm not a huge, not an active part, but I follow whatever I can. So yeah.
So you mentioned tokenized access. This is another, I'm new to tokens. What is tokenized access? How does that work?
So like there's the idea of like DAOs that are where tokens are shares, right? Or like voting
Okay.
shares or like, yield bearing shares or other things like that. But there's also the idea of like a DAO as a club where you get in with like a membership card, in which case like that can be an NFT type situation. Back in the early days of Axes, one of the staff members, Jiho, ran a Jiho DAO where if you had a Mystic Axie, you could gain access to this DAO, and they would, it was basically a Discord community that they talked about various things in. But like that idea of having a thing that gets you into a space, but that thing also being transferable, right? But not being like a shares position, because if it's stocks or shares or even voting shares, you're always thinking, should I only sell half, right? What's the value in
Right.
that sort of thing? Whereas like a single one-off token is like, do I want to be here or not? And if I don't, how does this get to somebody who wants to be here more than I do, right?
That makes sense. Okay.
And you
Okay.
can think about it too. Like when I think about some of the risks for the NFT space,
Hmm.
it's sort of linked to this like Steam and the online game stores, right? Like even the Xbox store and stuff like that. Like they're effectively using a token to control whether or not you can access whatever game you've paid for, right? What they're just not letting you do is pass that token on, right? Like the token is just a hash of some sort, it's linked to your account type thing. But like, were it an NFT, where it's something that you could actually pass on to other people and then they had the game, it would be very reminiscent of the old days of trading and buying and selling used games. And like, of course, all the companies have been trying to lock down on that for a long time because it's a potential way for them to profit more, right, by selling more copies. But
Right.
now that the space is emerging, now that NFTs exist, now that there are things that could threaten that, there's nothing really stopping them. Like Steam could mint every game as an NFT tomorrow, and people would suddenly be free of what they were doing before that. And it could be a
Hmm.
really interesting and big move. And like that's just tokenized access to a video game, right? At that point.
Well,
So
that could be absolutely incredible.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. And I could see it happening, right? Because otherwise, there's going to be other groups that do, right? Like now that
Yes.
the technology is so good, there's absolutely nothing stopping me from making an NFT that represents access to my new indie game that I built or commissioned to have built, and sell 10,000 of those NFTs. I could even have secondary market royalties as long as the marketplace has respected that, and that could be the only way I distribute a game if I
Yeah.
wanted to, and enough of that, and it's definitely going to undermine some of that, some of the lockdown that's already in existence.
I think watching that is going to be interesting. Really, really interesting because it seemed like everything went from handing a mixtape to your friend to having everything so heavily copyrighted that you couldn't make a mixtape anymore.
Right? Well, and it
And
came along with like the loss of value in all of that stuff.
yeah,
Like not only like they locked it down in a way that didn't make it digitally scarce, it made it valueless but terrifying. You now just had a bunch of contracts, right?
yeah,
Whereas now like the NFT space brings back digital scarcity as well, right? Like a company just selling 1 million of something and saying, "Hey, look, we're only making 1 million of this," is actually believable on chain, whereas it's not really believable in the physical space, and certainly not when you're doing a digital download that anyone can get. So yeah,
exactly. Or even digital downloads where you don't end up downloading it and you don't really own it, but somehow you've paid for it. Those
yeah,
are the ones that kind of really have been not sitting well with me lately. I want the thing. I want to own the thing. I want to be able to transfer the thing and share the thing.
yeah,
And
right. Well,
it's
and you see, like they were like we've been heading so quickly down the other direction. Like I compare some of this to things like right to repair legislation and stuff, and
yeah,
like we were getting to the point where corporations were getting ready to lock down a lot of physical objects behind the same kind of legislation that worked for purely digital goods, right? Like the DMCA and the
Yeah.
breaking of digital locks. And as that applies to things like repairing, say, John Deere tractors as the example, or sewing machines, or a number of different products, medical grade lasers, all that stuff that is like, they can just say, hey, look, if you are turning it on and you're using it without us, having authorized it, you must have broken a digital lock somewhere. Therefore, you're a hacker, and arresting you as a hacker instead of like thinking about you as someone who's trying to repair or fix or work on physical technology that exists and has value and should be salvaged. And
Which is crazy.
right? And so if NFTs suddenly force them to have to defend purely digital content as not access or not like compliant with things like the DMCA, then
Yeah.
at least it drives that war away from things like the physical front for a little while, maybe. There's a short story by a doctor, Unauthorized Bread, I think it is, or Unauthorized Toast, that I would highly
Okay.
recommend. Super
Okay.
good. It's part of a 4-part short story, but it's just really good. And it's just about somebody who's dealing with the fact that their toaster and their appliances are all DRM'd, like the toaster will only accept bread that comes from a specific manufacturer. And yeah.
It seems
Yeah.
crazy when you say that about toast, but printers do that with ink.
Exactly, right? It's not that big of a stretch. Or there's a
No.
dishwasher in it, right, that would only clean dishes that were bought from the same company as the dishwasher. And if it detects a dish that isn't from that, it refuses to turn on. And,
Well, and
like,
there are coffee machines that'll only work with their own brand of coffee pods, and
exactly. And in theory, like for the Keurig ones, it's a great example. Like, they were just printed text, I think.
yeah,
And so you were able to get around it by printing the same text on like something else that you were using, or other companies would get around it that way. But in theory, if Corey had figured out a way to, instead of having it be text, to be a key to a digital lock in the coffee pot, and as long
yeah,
as they could legally conceptualize it as that, then anyone circumventing that is in violation of the DMCA instead of just like trying to make their coffee maker work. And
which is
that's
crazy. And
ridiculous.
I
Yeah.
mean, if you get rid of all of that or lessen it slightly with the physical world, and hopefully with things that people are trying to copyright and lose value on, you bring back more community, which is seems to
Hopefully,
be
yeah.
everyone I talk to, every interview I have, and all of the things always circle back to that community.
Right? Yeah, and well, I think that's like, it reminds me a lot of like live music and things like that in
Yeah,
that way too, and that like you can access the live music through a lot of different ways, but a lot of people choose to pay for it in some way, shape, or form. And like an
yeah,
NFT, you can access the data behind an NFT in a lot of different ways. Like even if they were tokenized access to a video game, you could still pirate that video game. Even if
yeah.
it was tokenized access to a boxing match or something, you could still figure out a way to watch that match. But by buying the NFT, you're holding something now that proves that you have paid some money towards that service, and both you and the service can feel good about your contribution that way, right? And
Yeah.
that's new. Yeah.
Well, and that's like all I wanted to do for the last couple of months is pay for some music that I can own on my thing that's not connected to the internet.
Yeah.
And good luck with that. So
Right, but for the
I'm
first time, like 5 years from now, or even a year from now, there might be a whole NFT indie music scene that's, hundreds of artists deep that only release as NFTs. And then you could just go onto the
yeah,
Wax Marketplace, go onto Atomic Hub, buy tracks, and know that you're going to have them. And I mean, that'll be amazing. It's already starting, but like, it needs a
that's
critical mass before it's, yeah,
it does. And that's what I'm excited for. I want that
yeah,
back.
absolutely.
Well, that's all I have. So in closing, what are you grateful for right now?
Oh, today I'm grateful that my partner was able to drive me around so that I could take pictures and didn't have to drive a car. Because I don't mind driving, but it's nice to go all the way into town and back without having to worry about it and just get to look out the window.
That's wonderful.
Mm.
I'm weirdly grateful for the wind. It messed up my hair. It got my hair in my
Hmm.
face. It drove me crazy, but it reminded me of how much space I take up, and I'm grateful for that.
I really like that. I fly dual line stunt kites, so I like the wind
Ooh.
too.
Oh, that's interesting.
Uh,
All right. Well,
yeah.
thank you for joining me.
This was
This has been
fantastic.
a ton of fun. I'll be back Tuesday morning at 11:15 Eastern with a panel of guests, and the list is still being finalized. So it may well be a bit of a surprise, but we're working on it, and it could be amazing. It could be interesting. It could be the party room. So if you're up for surprises, I'm always up for surprises. That's the place to be.
Absolutely.
And Tuesday afternoon, 3 o'clock Eastern, I've rescheduled with M Blue, so that'll be good too. And
Ah,
hopefully we can talk again, a
I would
couple
love
months
that.
down the road when things are different and see where we're
So I'm
at.
sure so much will be different in just 2 months. So
Guaranteed. Well, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your evening.
thank you. You too, Jen. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Good night.